Welcome everyone to tonight's prep class. We are here in the Southland City Market Kitchen, and it's wonderful to have everyone join. I think we had about 60 people sign up tonight, so it's really exciting to think of that many people wanting to learn how to make prep. So just a little bit about my background. My name is Anna, and I'm one of the cooking instructors here at City Market. My background is in cultural anthropology, focused on food. So I very much like to teach cooking classes, taking into account the history and culture, as well as the sort of geography and regional variations of dishes, to be able to really keep them embedded in the history and culture that they've come out of. So in tonight's class, we're going to be learning how to make prep. And there's a lot of sort of technical things I'm hoping to teach in this hour and a half. But I'm also hoping to have a little bit of time at the end to talk more about sort of the traditions around prep making and some of the history. So if we were here in person, I would ask how many of you have made prep before. If this is your first time, you're in the right place. If you are an experienced prep maker, hopefully you'll take away some tidbits here and there from this class. I wanted to start by just saying that I think here in the States, we have this fascination with sweet prep. These wonderful dessert cups that have a myriad of fillings and are really exciting to make and are very festive. But in France and other parts of Europe, there are also savory cups, which are known as galettes. And I love the idea of transitioning prep also into a more savory, filling main course. So tonight we're going to start off by learning the technique for making the actual sweet prep. And then I will teach a second variation with a different batter, different grain, looking at the savory prep. So whether you're here for sweet or savory, I hope you'll get something out of it. This class is designed as a demo, so it's actually a fair amount of material we're going to be covering tonight. So I'm going to try to move pretty quickly. Things are prepped, so if anyone is trying to cook along, it's going to be at a fast pace. I will be teaching another class in December that will be designed more of a slower paced cook along, where everyone will be able to cook as we go. But definitely feel free to take notes and to ask questions. Carrie is here with me. Thank you, Carrie, for helping. She will be monitoring questions. So I'm hoping to make this as interactive as possible, given the online format. At any point, feel free to just type a question into the box, and we'll be able to just hear that question in real time, and I'll try to answer it. So a little bit about the background of prep. First of all, you may notice that I learned the word with the French pronunciation. I think a lot of times in the US we say crêpes, and to me that still sounds just a little bit sort of different than what I learned. I was living for 2 years in France when I sort of came upon prep for the first time. So I've gotten to know more as prep, the sweet prep, and then the savory version is known as galette. So we'll try to be incorporating some French terms, baking terms as we go. I am going to share with you tonight the recipes that I learned while I was in culinary school at the Cordon Bleu in London, and we learned a pretty standard recipe for the sweet prep, which you have here in your handout, and I'm going to be staying pretty strict to following that. There are many variations in terms of fillings for both sweet and savory prep, but in terms of the actual batter for the sweet prep, it's and some people would be perhaps offended if one were to mess with the proportions or ingredients. That being said, once you've mastered this, feel free to add in all kinds of flavorings, vanillas or liqueurs. That's definitely done. But I think the general thinking in France is that the batter is sort of this very delicate base, which doesn't have too much sweet in it. Rather, it's going to be the filling then that provides the flavoring. So if we add too much sugar into the sweet batter, then it's going to make for an overall overly sweetened dessert. So keep your sugary sort of flavorings in the filling. So The original crêpes, let's just take first a brief journey back to France, to Northwestern France. Here we've got on the back of your handout a map. The original crêpe really came out of the Brittany region. And this is the region that is still very proudly sort of identified as the original crêpe and galette area. It's a region that has very arid soil and rocky cliffs and mountains, and it's not very hospitable to growing wheat. So the wheat that was grown there didn't do very well. And there was an introduction, we think in the 12th century, of buckwheat, which is actually not a wheat at all, it's gluten-free. It's a grain that originates in northern China, and there are varying theories on how it was introduced to northern France. Some say it came with the Arab Saracens, and its name is actually Saracen, the Saracens. Others think it came more through Russia into France. And basically, all we know is that by the 12th century, buckwheat was thriving in this rocky terrain in the Brittany region, and it's a grain that does very well in poor soil. So it was actually a wonderful addition to the wheat that wasn't growing so easily there, and so buckwheat became used as kind of the primary grain for porridge and gruels. This was just mixed in a big pot on an open fire and turned into a porridge. We think that the original crêpe came about by a sort of a kitchen mistake, a culinary mistake, which is how many recipes we know are invented. And there was, the legend has it that there was a Breton housewife who was making her porridge and spilled some of the porridge onto a hot rock on the fireplace, and it sort of sizzled and turned into this wonderful flat pancake. And that was sort of the original galette. The full name is crêpe galette, which basically means a flat griddle cake or a flat cake with crispy edges. Crispus is the Latin, which means sort of the crispy edges. So that was probably the first crêpe, was actually a buckwheat crêpe. Then fast forward to the early 20th century is when finely milled white flour became much more affordable, and that's when the sweet crêpes originated. So we are going to go a little bit out of order chronologically and start with the sweet crêpe, because I think that's what maybe most people are a little more familiar with, and then I'll show you the variation using buckwheat. So to begin with, I'm going to really try to share with you the method that I was taught in culinary school, and all the kind of little precise details along the way. So feel free to, disregard whatever isn't functional or efficient for your kitchen. But basically, the first step with any baking recipe is to do collect your things, do your mise en place. And that applies both to your ingredients as well as your cooking equipment. So in order to make crêpes the French way, it really is necessary to have a crêpe pan. So that's the first step. If you don't already have a crêpe pan, you can find them locally, usually at Kiss the Cook. Home Goods also has them. Kitteridge out in Williston has them. Just call, because I've heard a lot are having supply chain issues right now. But if you're looking for one, they're usually they start at $25. You can also find them on Amazon. But basically, a crêpe pan is different than a frying pan in a number of ways. It has a thicker bottom generally that is going to warm evenly, and the crêpe will burn less like on this pan. It generally has a coating that is non-stick, so either an official non-stick pan. I try to avoid non-stick just for health reasons, but if you're using a high heat, it can be good to use either like a blue steel like this. There's also enameled steel. I think the pan at Home Goods is enameled steel, the one they have there. Otherwise, cast iron can also work if it's well seasoned. The disadvantage with cast iron is that it's rather heavy. And as you will see, there's a lot of like quick pan tilting involved in the cooking technique. So cast iron is a little more challenging. But the first step is to look for a crepe pan. I recommend generally for home use the de Bauer pan that was made in France. This pan was sent to me by an aunt in France years ago, and it doesn't have any markings, so I don't know the mark. But de Bauer is a good brand and relatively affordable. In the crêperies in Breton, you will see these huge, large sort of grills or skillets that are wonderful and make these much larger 20 centimeter crepes that are then folded in a different way. But those are quite expensive. I think they start at $3,000 and not really functional for home use. So these pans are great. So probably one of the most important things with crepe making at home is to have the correct pan and ladle. So let me see where my ladle is. Basically, the proportion you want is an 8-inch pan. An 8-inch is the bottom, not the sides, and a 1/4 cup ladle. You can use a 1/4 cup measuring cup. I find the ladle is much easier because you can just leave it in the bowl without it falling in. That ratio is essential for getting the correct thickness of the crepe. So if you're just, if you've made crepe before and have been sort of using a little more informal method, that may be why they don't get as thin as possible. The batter consistency is also really important, which we'll talk about. The other tools that are helpful to have are crepe sort of spatula. I like a wooden one. You can really use anything, but again, once you've invested in your pan, it's great to just use wood to not scratch it. A sieve is helpful both for the sifting as well as for passing the batter through the sieve at the end, and then a whisk. And then finally, if your kitchen doesn't already have a scale, it's really helpful in terms of precision baking to scale ingredients based on weight rather than volume. And why is that? It's because if you imagine, getting a cup of flour from the bag, that cup could be mashed down, it could be overflowing. There's just much more accuracy when we measure by weight. So again, scales are available locally at Kiss the Cook. I was just in there the other day to check, and they have 2 or 3 different models, which look pretty good and are not too expensive. So the first step, and feel free to follow along with the recipe if you would like. The first step is to start by warming our butter. So as you probably know, butter is a key ingredient in French cooking, and that holds true for the crepe making as well. So I have a butter pan here where I've warmed the butter that is going to go into the recipe. There are different amounts of cooking down the butter. In the traditional recipe, it calls for beurre noisette. Does anyone know what noisette means? Let's see if anybody comes up with the answer. If you can imagine beurre noisette, you're aiming for a slightly browned butter here. So you want to melt your butter and then let it sort of caramelize a little bit so the milk solids are turning brown. Noisette means hazelnut, so you're basically making it sort of brown like hazelnut, or sort of and it will have a nuttier flavor. So browning butter is a technique that's used a lot in French baking, and especially for the sweet crepe, I recommend it. It's great in the savory galette as well, but we'll just, focus on the color we're looking for here right now. If you take it too dark, it will get burned. If you're worried about presentation, definitely keep an eye on how dark it's getting, because you might not want little flecks of dark in your final crepe. So while that is warming, we then are going to start with our dry ingredients. Now I've scaled these out already, but basically what you would do is you would put your new scale here, you would put a bowl on and then put the flour in, or tar it, put the flour in until you have your exact measurement. And again, it's also a lot simpler because you just have your bowl then ready to go. So we start by sifting the flour. So this is just all-purpose flour. So getting out any lumps. They, old recipes say sift your flour. Nowadays, most milling it's sifted and there's not as many lumps as there used to be, but it's still a good practice to do that. Sift the flour. Then we're going to add in the sugar and salt, so all of our dry ingredients. A note about the sugar, it calls for caster sugar. I learned this recipe in the UK, so they call where caster sugar is much more common. It's basically very fine grained sugar. And you can transform your white sugar into caster sugar by just putting it into a blender or a spice grinder or anything and just give it a couple of pulses. The idea is that it will then disperse more quickly. And then a pinch of salt. So anytime we add sugar into a sweet recipe we're making, it actually will bring out the sweet of the sugar to add just a tiny bit of salt. So really just a pinch. But it's been interesting. I've actually noticed when I forget to do that step, the batter doesn't taste quite the same if we leave out the salt. So we then are just going to quickly combine our dry ingredients. And now moving on to the wet ingredients, which are the egg and milk. So it's good to have your egg at room temperature. This recipe, I actually scaled down from a larger recipe, so I think it calls for eggs, but it's really just one egg for this. I think I scaled it for a serving of 4, aiming for 2 crêpes per person, so 8 crêpes total. So, and there are actually 2 methods. I'm going to teach you the method I was taught in school, but if you go back to some of the old French cookbooks, they will add the egg in first and mix the egg and then add your milk, almost like you're doing a mayonnaise, little bits at a time. What we were taught was to mix beat together your egg and your milk and then add the liquid ingredients. And I find I get a few less lumps that way. So adding in the milk, it's important to use whole milk here. I like Stratford Creamery non-homogenized milk because it still has the cream and I just shake it all up. And I just feel like it's a little less processed. Any questions so far?
No questions so far. Everybody's just really excited.
Okay, great. So we're together the egg and the milk. And then we're going to make a little well called a fontaine. You hear that a lot. You see that a lot in French recipes. Sort of a little well or nest in the center. And we're gradually going to add the wet ingredients. I don't know if you can see here, but I'm incorporating the flour, not fully, just the flour that's around the edge of the well. And making sure there aren't any lumps. And then adding the rest. So this is the part where you want to take a little bit of time and just mix carefully, making sure you're not getting any lumps. Now, if you really wanted to be a lot faster with this, some people do throw it into their blender, and that's totally fine, but I felt obliged to teach you the traditional method. So I think with the blender, there's a slight risk of over-mixing, whereas this, you can always, just anything you do by hand, you can monitor it a little bit more until just at the point where you've incorporated all of the flour before it's overmixed. So what you're aiming for is to have a final consistency, basically like heavy cream. So that's a good ballpark to aim for, both for this recipe as well as the buckwheat recipe. So if you can see that, to me that seems like cream, perhaps slightly thick. So all flour is different, and so sometimes you're going to have to adjust your liquid, but that's looking good. It's important then for the batter to rest, and I think in the handout it says at least 15 minutes. I would say if you can, give it at least an hour rest, If you're in a hurry, 15 will be fine, but it's good to basically let it just be for at least an hour so that right now you've really kind of disturbed the gluten in the wheat, and this way it can relax and just kind of rest, and it will be an easier batter to work with. So let me see when my cloth is. So always good to cover the batter. If you are putting it in the fridge overnight, which I generally do because a long rest, I find it just improves the batter slightly. You can keep it in the fridge really up to 24 hours. Just make sure to cover it with an airtight lid. This batter is very, how should I describe it? It's very delicate and absorbs all sorts of scents around it. So if you have a fridge with, salad dressing or onions, your batter, if not sealed with an airtight lid, will absorb those flavors, which is what we're not aiming for. So then we're going to set that aside and let it rest. And if it's just an hour, it's totally fine on the countertop. It doesn't have to go into the fridge. So any questions about the batter before we go on to the syrup? No, okay, great. So in thinking about what dessert filling I wanted to teach with this class, I basically felt there was sort of only one choice at first, and that is the sirop de citron. And this is the classic lemon syrup that it doesn't sound like much. It sort of sounds like, okay, you make a simple syrup and you add your lemon, but the flavor is really out of this world. When I first tried it in culinary school, that was the first time I had tasted this particular way of serving lemon and sugar with a crepe. It was just so delicious. It was hard to imagine how simple something like how a recipe that's so simple could taste that good. So it takes a little bit of time and patience, but it's totally worth the effort. So I would say don't skip this recipe. Even if I think a lot of times if anyone's had crepe in like French class or if you've made crepe at home, you often will just put on some lemon juice and then sprinkle some sugar, and that's really great and it's nice, but the sirop de citron is like 10 times better. It's really good.
So we do have a question in the chat. Someone wants to know, how are you able to tell if the batter has been overmixed? And if it has, is there any way to fix that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Ironically, I don't really tell until I am putting it into the pan. And then it can be a little bit harder to work with in the pan. So what I try to do is to really only mix it until you've incorporated all of the lumps. And it's not like bread baking. I would say it's not nearly as finicky or sensitive to that. So don't worry about over mixing it. It's definitely better to have it more mixed than not mixed. But the key is to just be watching it, and as soon as the lumps are gone, then you're pretty much good to go.
We also have someone who wants to know, how do you spell the name of the crepe pan from France?
Oh, yes, great question. So on the handout, I've included a section on equipment that should be on I think it's about page 4. So here there's a list with all of the tools, and there's a section selecting a crepe pan. So the spelling is D-E, new word, B-U-Y-E-R, and it's their blue steel pan. So yeah, and that also lists the other local stores where you can find it. Yeah. Okay, and so that actually reminds me, there's one last step that's good to do before we rest the batter. And this is something that sometimes, if you're in a hurry and you've mixed it well and there are not lumps, you can omit this step. But it traditionally was very important, especially when flour wasn't so finely milled. And that is to just pass it again through a sieve here. And we would do this before we really rest it. And this is just to make sure we've gotten out all of the lumps. So you can tell we did a pretty good job here. I don't see major lumps, but that just ensures that it's going to be really smooth. Okay, so back to resting. And there's one ingredient we have not yet added. What is that? That is the butter. So we're going to add the butter right at the very end when we're about ready to use it. Okay, so back to the lemon syrup. This is, let's see, you want to turn to the recipe. It's on the second page. This is an amount that should be roughly equivalent to the 8 crêpes that the sweet batter makes. But it's really good and you can use it for lots of other things, so feel free to double up the recipe if you'd like. So the first step is to peel the lemon and make ribbons. Carrie did this for me earlier very kindly. Thank you, Carrie. But there are basically a number of tools to do this. You can use a regular vegetable peeler, works well. You're aiming to get just the yellow without the white, which is going to be more bitter. There is also a special zester that has the actual just like small ribbon shape, and you can order those online. They're usually for drinks. And that will save you a little bit of work. But once you have peeled the lemon, then you want to just take a knife and slice it into these fine ribbons. As fine as you can get, these are what are going to sort of curl up and be your garnish on the crepe, as well as really flavor the syrup. So once you have peeled the lemon, then we're just going to juice it. We need the juice of 1 lemon here. And I generally like to get organic lemons, especially when you're using the skin like this, so we are not getting the extra pesticides. And while you're doing this, you can also be preparing the tops. Basically, you're going to need 2 small pans for the stovetop. One in which we will add the sugar and water, which we'll bring to a boil, and that will make the sort of simple syrup. It's just the classic simple syrup recipe. The other pan can be a little bit larger, and that pan is going to be used to blanch the lemon. So you might be wondering, why do we want to blanch the lemon when we're trying to get as much flavor from it as possible? There is something about the blanching process that extracts the extreme bitterness of the lemon and leaves the lemon flavor, all of this sort of fruity citrus lemon flavor, but takes out the bitterness. And it really, I think, is one of the key steps to making this syrup as delicious and sweet and citrusy as it is. So we could just throw these right into the pan with a simple syrup, but it's going to produce a totally different product. In the end, it's going to be much more bitter. So we're going to put these into a pot of water. Okay, so I just put those on the stovetop in a pot of water, and that's going to come to a boil. What you're watching for is, as soon as the water starts to simmer, you're going to let it boil and bubble for 1 minute, and then take it to the sink, and using a strainer, just dump out the water, refresh it with another batch of cold water, and put it back on the stove. And Carrie very nicely said she would help with this part. And you're going to repeat that 3 times. Each time you're getting out a little bit more of that bitter flavor. All right, in your other pan, and now this is a little large for the job, but this is the smallest we have here, but probably you could use a slightly smaller one. We are going to combine the sugar. Again, caster sugar is great, but honestly, with this part, it's going to dissolve quickly, so if you don't feel like making your caster sugar, that's fine. I'm going to dissolve the sugar. It looks like a lot of sugar in a 1/4 cup of water, but that sugar is going to dissolve very quickly, and we're then going to reduce it down. So this is going to go onto the stovetop. Okay, great. So here is our stovetop. We've got the lemon peel in this pot, which is already turning yellow, and it's going to be boiling soon. And we've got the simple syrup, the sugar dissolving in the water here. So I'm going to let Carrie monitor those for us. If you have a helper in the kitchen, that's a great job for a kid to do, to help out with the lemon peels. But while that's going, we're just going to take a quick look. Okay, so we've got the lemon juice here, and that's going to be added to the syrup as soon as it sort of reduces down just a little bit. So that is pretty much it for the simple syrup. We'll see. I'll show you the final steps. While that is finishing up, we can turn back to our batter. And let's just pretend it's been resting for about an hour. And now is the time to add the beurre noisette. So we've melted the butter. We've gotten it to this sort of slightly brown, nutty look. And if you're the one doing this, you will see the butter aroma really changes as you go from sort of this sweet butter to then a little bit more like a caramel nutty smell, which is really nice. I know a lot of people who just do this for chocolate chip cookies, and it makes a great addition to the flavor. So we're going to add this in. And I want you to see the hue. There are about 3 or 4 different levels of brown butter in French cuisine, and each one is indicated in a recipe and is very specific. This is, you can see that what we're aiming for with beurre noisette is just sort of a light brown. And then we're going to whisk that together. Okay. So I have here a hot plate. I'm going to try for the first time to make a crepe on this hot plate. You'll find that probably the most challenging thing about crepe making is the actual cooking of the batter correctly. And so don't be discouraged if you have a couple of flops. Generally, the first 1 or 2 crepes turn out not as good as the remaining crepes. Let's put it that way. So that's totally fine. Once you start using a pan and a particular burner, whether it's gas or electric, you'll get used to the pairing of those two, and you'll have a pretty good sense of sort of, you know, what temperature is going to be best, how long do I need to cook it for. So this is my first time using this burner, so I'm going to experiment here and see.
It's hot. It's hot.
It gets very hot. Okay, thank you, Carrie. That's good to know. You definitely don't want to overcook the crepe. So you may be wondering what we're going to use to grease the pan. People have used all sorts of things, but the sort of traditional thing to use here is clarified butter. What is clarified butter? If you turn to your handout, here I think this is page 3, there's a little explanation. Clarified butter is essentially butter that has been reduced by letting the water evaporate and also letting the milk fats come to the surface, and then we skim them off, and basically that makes our butter extra high heat tolerant. Because the thing that burns, like when we are putting butter on a pancake pan, the thing that ends up burning is the milk fats, the solids. The milk solids, they caramelize and will turn dark. But if we can remove those, what remains is the fat, and that can be just like, you know, coconut oil or canola oil, a really high heat oil to use. And I actually make my, you know, pancakes at home with the clarified butter. So it's really simple to do. I have a little recipe there. It really doesn't matter the quantity you make. It's generally, if you're going to go through the process, good to try to do at least, I would say, maybe like 500 grams. And you just put the butter into a saucepan, kind of a large surface one is good so that the water can evaporate more quickly. And then you just sort of simmer it on low, skimming off the solids as they come to the top. And you just throw those away, and the water will evaporate. And then very carefully you pour it out, because there will be some solids at the bottom of the pan. And you keep that milk fat. And then you've got your own clarified butter. So a substitute, if you don't want to make it, you can actually use ghee. So that is India's version of clarified butter, which is made in the exact same way. And City Market carries a number of different brands. So again, the advantage to using clarified butter or ghee over butter is that it's not going to burn. If anything burns here, it's going to be the cup itself, but we don't have to worry about the actual fat in the pan burning. And that's important, especially as we're doing many cup. So we're going to see how quickly this melts. Yes, it is very hot. So you're aiming for, I would say, start with like a medium heat, and you may need to then turn it down. But I have a little too much, and we don't want to fry our cups. It's not deep frying, so I'm going to pour a little bit of this back. You just need it to be able to sort of coat the pan. All right, so now is the moment of truth where we do a final test of our batter. We take a look. To me, this looks good, but it may be a little bit thick. So we won't know for sure until we've done the first one, and then we may need to adjust the batter. Is everyone still with me? Yes? Great, okay. So you can tell that the pan is ready to receive the crepe when you can feel the heat about here. If you throw water onto the pan, it should sizzle. That's a sign that it's hot and perhaps going towards too hot. So this is the part that really it's practice that will teach you more than just watching. So I encourage you to make a large batch, and you can just practice and share your cup with your household. But you want to start with a very full ladle. I'm letting it drip to the side, so I'm not carrying it over as it's dripping. I'm picking up the pan, so it's off the heat, so it's not as hot as it will be. And then I am pouring it on the pan and turning the pan. Okay, so this is very revealing. Your first crepe will give you lots of information here. This is showing me that my pan was a little bit hot, but more important than that is the batter is a little bit thick. Did you see how it didn't go and coat the pan all the way? That's because it was just a little bit too thick to get around. As I mentioned in the beginning, the proportion of the quarter cup ladle, which is, I think, 2 ounces, I think it's 60 milliliters, is exactly right to coat the entire bottom of the pan. So we're going to see how this goes. And while it's cooking, add just a little bit more milk. So this is really a fun process to do over and over again, because what you can do is once you've seen that, how thick that batter was, and then the result in the pan, you'll get a sense that it might have been a little bit thick. Okay, so I can see what Carrie meant, that it's a very hot burner. I've gone down to sort of the medium-low setting. And what we're aiming for here is to watch for when the edges are getting curly. Remember the word crispus, the Latin sort of root of the word crepe. We're looking for sort of curly edges. And then we're able to flip it. Okay, so this is all right. It got a little bit brown. We generally are aiming for the more golden coloring, not this dark brown. And we will see, again, your first crepe often is going to be a little bit deformed like this, with the batter not quite reaching the edge here, and the coloring not quite right. Maybe as the heat is adjusting, but it smells good. It smells great. So we will see. Now, while that's happening, I just want you to know Carrie is pouring out the lemon peel over the sink and refreshing with more water. So I think we've done 2 batches. That's the third. She's quick. That's great. All right. So she's done the third time through, and then we'll head over to the stove top to see how that's coming along. So here's how the second side looks. Again, this is showing me, you see those dark spots, that's showing me that the pan is a little bit too hot. So I'm gonna turn this down, take it off for a second. And would you like to see another crepe, or do you want to jump over to the syrup? What do you prefer? Any suggestions?
No, I do have another 2 questions for you that we can talk about maybe while you're making another crepe.
Yeah, great.
Someone wants to know if they can use margarine instead of butter.
Oh, good question. So technically margarine I think would work. It just has a different flavor than the butter. So you're gonna end up having the crepe just with a slightly different flavor, but feel free to try it. And if it's to your liking, then absolutely, it should perform okay. Yeah.
And then somebody else wanted to know if you can use a different type of milk, like almond or soy.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And I should have mentioned that. You know, if you want to avoid cow's milk, you can definitely use, there are lots of substitutes, almond, soy, oat milk. In some regions, actually the poorer regions, sort of in olden times, didn't always have access to milk and would just use water. So feel free to do that, or you can even cut your milk with water if you don't have enough milk. The recipe is, you know, as technical as I said it was to begin with, this was sort of a countryside recipe originally, and yeah, it's very forgiving. So yeah, any liquid you want to try, feel free to experiment with. So I'm going to try another one. I've turned the heat down slightly. Okay, so again, I think my pan is very hot, but you see how the batter is spreading a little bit more easily, and that's because we thinned it out here. If you see bubbles starting to appear in the crepe, that means that your pan is a little bit on the hot side. So let that cook. Let me take a look at the syrup. Okay, so if you want to try to multitask while your crepe is going, you can see the syrup has boiled down. It's much thicker. We're going to reduce that a little bit more. But first, we're going to add the lemon juice. So this is going to combine with the sugar and get reduced. And then the final step will be adding the lemon peel. So I'm mixing that in, and I'm going to put it on probably for about 3 to 4 more minutes on medium heat.
We had someone ask, what about coconut oil?
Oh, coconut oil, interesting. Yes, that would absolutely perform the function of making it not stick. I think it would definitely just impart a different flavor, but if you want to try coconut oil, absolutely. Yeah.
And then someone else asked, if your batter is too thin rather than too thick after resting, how would you fix that?
Yes, so that is a little bit more challenging, and we always say, you know, go slowly with the addition of milk, because you can add more flour, but your proportion of flour to egg to butter is going to be a little bit off then. It's much more malleable and flexible to be able to take or receive less of the liquid than the flour. And also remember, we've already sifted the flour, so there's the risk that you can sift the flour in. But yeah, you can add more flour, but it's generally frowned upon to have to add more flour after the liquid. And just to go back to the coconut oil question, if you're going to use coconut oil in the pan and are trying to avoid butter, you could certainly just melt the oil and use that in the recipe also as the fat instead of butter. So take a look at this. This is more what we're aiming for in terms of the sort of coloring. We're looking for that sort of golden yellow brown with a little bit more over here, but not as brown as that first one. So I guarantee your cups each one will be better and better as you go along. And you can see the sides are going to be a little bit more wavy and crispy because of the thinner batter.
And then another question came through. Yeah. Do you not need the T-shaped tool that's shown in the handout? And I believe that's the tool for the big.
Yes. So great question. Let's see. Do I have that? Yeah. Okay. So this T-shaped tool it's a little bit misleading, honestly, in that picture. So I apologize for that. I didn't make that picture, but that is what's used in Brittany for the large skillets where the batter is actually sort of pushed around on it. They're too heavy to be able to lift up and turn as we were doing with the pan. So you actually don't need that tool when you're using the smaller 8-inch pan. But if you are lucky enough to find yourself with a large skillet, then you would use that to sort of push out the batter. Yeah, great.
It's like how they do it at Skinny Pancake, if you've ever been there, and you see them on the big tabletop makers.
It's really fun to watch. And if you're, when the border opens and you can go to Montreal again, you can watch. There are a lot of crêperies there where they make them and you can just watch. It's great. Okay, so we're aiming for the bottom side to be almost as dark as the top, but not quite. So just a little bit longer here. Okay. All right, so this is looking good. So in France, there's considered to be sort of a more beautiful side of the crêpe and an uglier side of the crêpe. It totally depends on your individual crêpe and how it's looking, but generally the first side down is considered your presentation side. So as you're plating it, it's good to keep that in mind. So for this, I'm going to flip it and put it on my plate this way. So you can see the second side. It's quite different actually than the first side. I'm going to turn off the heat, and our last step is going to be to finish off the simple syrup by adding the blanched ribbons. You see how much the color has changed? And if you try one now, you'll see it's delicious. It's not that same sort of bitter lemon flavor. We're going to add them to the simple syrup. Okay, so this is great. This has already reduced down a significant amount. It could even go a little farther if you wanted. You can play around with how thick or thin you'd like it. But the key is that you do not add the lemon until you have your desired consistency for the syrup. We are only going to infuse the lemon in the syrup. We're not actually going to reduce it any further. Why is that? It's because the lemon will actually get a little bit bitter if we boil it. Still, after 3 times of blanching, it will still impart a little bit of a bitter flavor if we actually heat it that much. So we're going to add the lemon. And then we're going to remove it from the heat and ideally cover it. And we can keep it covered then for about 10 minutes or so. You can do that. Okay, so while the syrup is just infusing, this is a key step, so don't rush it. It can just sit there. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the other filling options, and then we'll put on the lemon syrup. So there are many ways to present your dessert crêpe. I was going to, if we were here in person, I would ask what are some of people's favorite things to put on dessert crêpe. Generally, you probably know fruits are really common, so any kind of a jam, a compote, or a coulis, or fresh fruits with whipped cream, apples and walnuts and honey are nice. The classic, probably everybody has had or heard of, the chocolate hazelnut spread Nutella is a favorite. And I just wanted to mention a word about hazelnut production and Nutella. You may have seen last year the New York Times did a wonderful article, an expose on child labor that is involved in the hazelnut industry, and really, I think, educated a lot of us. It was the first time I learned about basically how hazelnuts are grown. I think 70% of the world's hazelnuts are coming out of Turkey. And most of that production goes to Ferrero, which is the company that makes Nutella. And unfortunately, there are many refugees who are exploited, refugees from Syria who come to Turkey. Also, the Kurds from the south are coming to work in these hazelnut regions where they're worked about like 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and paid much lower than the local minimum living wage. So because of that, there's been a lot of pressure on these companies that are purchasing the hazelnuts. So I just wanted to put in the plug for perhaps staying away from Nutella until Ferrero can be more responsible about their sourcing of hazelnuts. And City Market carries this organic product that I think is fair trade and is a great substitute, and it tastes the same. But basically that age-old combination of chocolate and hazelnut is wonderful on cup. So that's going to be an option. While the syrup is infusing, I'm just going to show you one possible way of plating. So let's see here. So let's say it is the middle of summer and we are getting lots of fresh fruits from the garden. Maybe we want to do like a fruit plate. So in my fridge, I happen to have some stone fruit jam. I think this is apricot and peach jam. And then in the freezer, I had some berries, some blueberries and gooseberries. So I just made a quick sort of compote with blueberries and gooseberries. And we're going to show you one option for plating the cup. You can just sort of spread the jam on the inside. And then just close the top and the bottom so that we'll have a clear edge, and then roll it up.
While you're demonstrating that, I have another question here.
Yeah.
Someone asked, is there a story about crepes giving you luck? Because they think they heard of something, but they don't remember it.
Oh, that's such a great question. Yes, and actually at the end, I have a little presentation I'm hoping to have time for to talk about. There's a whole tradition. There's even a national crepe day when everybody in France makes crepes, and they're considered to bring good luck. So yes, I will get to that at the end. That's great. Remind me.
Yep. And then someone else would like to know if there's a replacement for eggs to make a totally vegan crepe batter.
Oh, that's a great question. So I can't speak from experience on that. I've never actually made a vegan crepe, but I would say to try the flaxseed and water technique. And if you just like Google egg substitute and flax, you'll get the proportions for how much flax and water to substitute for an egg. And you can try that. Yeah, that would be interesting to try. And I think, you know, it would turn out fine because back in the day, you know, they didn't always have egg probably. And I've definitely heard, especially the buckwheat cup, of not using egg. So yeah, feel free to experiment. So I'm making the second cup with the gooseberry filling. And if I had a third jam, I love raspberry in cups. I would probably do that and serve them as a trio. So you can roll them up, and I would do a better job probably of measuring them so they would be all the same size. And then you could put 3 together and, you know, garnish them with some of the fruits that you have inside, maybe a sprig of mint, some whipped cream. But that could be one option to do, just a very simple fruit cut for summer. All right, now let's look at how we would serve the sirop de citron, which should be about ready now. The first step is to fold your cup. So traditionally, when this is served in restaurants, it's generally served in the same way everywhere. I don't think I've had a variation in terms of the presentation when it's been in France. So we first look for our good side, which is the bottom side. We're going to fold our cup in half and then in quarters, and do that with the second cup. Generally, it's considered that 2 cups like this will make 1 dessert serving. And just like this with the sort of triangles towards each other. Thank you.
Everyone says, no question, they just want to say thank you and they're excited to try.
Yay! I wish everybody could be here because this is the funnest part, is to actually taste together the simple syrup. But if you can see what it looks like, the syrup has thickened and we have the ribbons have gotten really nice and soft. So they're going to be, you know, chewable and not too chewy. And we're just going to drizzle on the syrup first. I think in one class recently, someone asked, well, why don't you fill the crepe with the syrup? Why do you put it just on top? And it's a good question. It's because the syrup is so, it just permeates the crepe, and the crepe is so delicate, it just sort of soaks up the syrup, that there's something about having the 2 layers in a row with the syrup on top that just makes for a great sort of mouthfeel. And it's not really necessary to fill it, because they'll get plenty of syrup. And then you can just spread out your some of your ribbons on the plate on top. Make sure they know what they're getting. I always like to put a little bit of a kind of clue or hint as to what the flavoring is as the garnish. So here we go. Here are the sirop de citron, or crêpes au citron. They're also called the crepe with a simple syrup made with lemon. So feel free to experiment. You could try this with, you know, grapefruit or orange, but I think lemon, I always have come back to lemon as really the classic. All right. So any questions before we move on to the buckwheat?
The last one that came in is, for sweet crepes, how does one determine whether to use filling rolled inside or topping added on top? Is the type of filling the sauce that you make?
Yeah. So it's really up to your own sort of creative inspiration, I would say. The one very traditional one that is served always in the same way is with this lemon syrup. But I would say a lot of the fruit compotes and jams I've seen rolled up. But I've also seen like open face crepe where people will do all kinds of fancy things like do little lines of chocolate and whipped cream and then sort of twirl them together and just fold it slightly so it's open on the sides. So really you can get creative. Oftentimes what I like to do is make a stack of the crepes so they're all ready to go, especially for the sweet ones. They don't need to be served hot. And then you can just play around with plating them different ways and just have all of your toppings ready to go and just kind of experiment and see what you like. It's, I think, a great way to get inspiration is to just look at pictures online. If you just type in, you know, dessert crepes, you'll see all kinds of great ideas. People have been really creative. But the most traditional way for the lemon syrup is to fold them like that into quarters. All right, so moving on to our buckwheat. So for the buckwheat, I just wanted to put in a plug for the sort of nutritional value of buckwheat. If you're thinking, oh, I just want to do the sweet crepe, I would say definitely give this a try because it is such a unique flavor. When I lived in France, I was first in Lyon and then spent a year in Paris sort of eating a lot of crepe. And most of the time, the crepes were like what we have at City Pancake. They were the white flour crepe filled with sweet and savory fillings. Every once in a while, I would come across a crêperie that said crêperie Breton, and that was one where I would find this batter that had such a different flavor. And at the time, I had no idea I wasn't as interested in sort of culinary issues, but I was just sort of really enjoying these crepes. And it was later on that I realized that it's the buckwheat that gives it that really unique flavor. At the end of that year, I made a little sort of culinary pilgrimage to Brittany to really understand more about these crepes. And that's where I learned how wonderful the buckwheat is. It is very, very nutritionally dense. It has all 8 of the essential amino acids to make a complete protein. As I mentioned earlier, it's gluten-free, so it's really good for folks that might not be able to have the wheat crepe. And you can put sweet fillings in these if you'd like, but I'd say the flavor really does lend itself for sort of savory with herbs and cheeses. So To speed things up, since it's just an hour-and-a-half class, I have already actually made the batter for this one. It's the same process, it just does not have the sugar. And because buckwheat is a little bit more sort of thick and dense, it takes more liquid. So for this recipe, we add the milk separately so that we can control it a little bit more. I think there's also more variation in terms of buckwheat flours. Some of them are much more finely milled and don't require as much liquid. So this is the amount with the minimum recommended liquid in the recipe. I gave you a range. It's good to just start with the minimum. My sense is that this looks a little bit too thick. Does this look like cream to everyone? Remember, we're aiming for cream. Carrie's shaking her head no. I agree with you. I think it needs a little bit more milk to reach that consistency of full cream.
Looks more like yogurt.
It does. Yes. All right, so I'm gonna warm my pan again. And we're gonna use the same process of clarified butter on the pan. And when you do this the first time, you'll just see the flavor of the sort of toasting buckwheat is just amazing. There's really nothing else like it. So let's see how this is gonna work here. Just gonna rinse off my ladle so we don't cross-contaminate with the wheat flour. Okay. And if anyone has had, spent time in Eastern Europe, you may have had kassa and sort of grain salads made with buckwheat. That's a whole nother way to use buckwheat. That's great. All right, so melted butter. And while our batter is resting here, I'm actually going to do the filling first and give this a little more time to rest since I just added the liquid. So now is when we do want our frying pan. I was very anti-frying pan for a crepe pan, but that is what we're going to need for this part. There are many different fillings for the savory buckwheat crepe. I would say that let your garden be your guide for this. Whatever you have growing in your garden is going to be great. You can find a way to use herbs and vegetables. Some of my favorites I'm going to show you tonight. So some classics you've probably seen are basically mushrooms and shallots with the cheese. Cheese is very common. It's used really, I would say that's sort of the standard, and then you get fancier and more expensive as you add other things. But tonight I'm going to show you one of my favorite fillings, and that's because I love kale, and it's what I have in the garden this time of year. But I also am going to add something that I really like for its texture. And we're a little out of season, but this is going to be an herbed courgette or zucchini and kale filling, vegetable filling. So zucchini are actually on sale this week at City Market. I was excited to see. But the reason that I am using them even now in November is because of the texture that they're going to add. Not unlike mushrooms, they add this sort of great, a little bit of a sort of good mouthfeel with the rest of the crepe or the galette. So then I'm also going to have an allium, and you can use either onions or shallots. I actually like to use both. You've probably seen in French cooking, shallots are sort of the fancy onion that is used. I think of them as a little bit more sweet and delicate, and they are just very reminiscent to me of French cuisine. But I also like to have a little bit more of that kind of robust onion flavor. So I'm gonna start with melting a good amount of butter. I think it's 50 grams in the recipe. So I mentioned earlier that making the crepe is actually very, the batter is very precise, and you do have to be very, kind of, all the proportions need to work well together. The vegetable filling is much more forgiving, so feel free to kind of adjust those as needed. For example, that's too much butter. Again, I scaled in the recipe this out to be about the filling for 8 savory cups. I'm going to make a little bit less than is in the recipe tonight. So we're going to start with the minced onion and shallot. And we're going to saute these. I love the smell of butter and shallot. Definitely reminds me of France. And then while this is sauteing, I was just going to mention the herbs. So over here, this is pretty much all I have left from my garden at this point. But the sage and oregano and thyme are still hanging on. Those are some of the herbs that form a blend that is used really throughout France called herbes de Provence. And that's what I've recommended in this recipe. It's a dry blend that contains, generally, the standard is oregano, marjoram, thyme, rosemary, and savory. And I think that's winter savory. And they're blended together. In the US market, they generally add lavender. I think they think that we think of Provence with all the lavender fields, and if it doesn't have lavender, it's not Provençal. But actually in France, it doesn't generally have that lavender. It's such a strong flavor. It may compete with some of the others. So we're going to be adding the herbes de Provence. It's okay to use dry. If you do have them fresh, just use probably about 2 to 3 times the amount in the recipe. And it's great to add in the fresh herbs at the end. So we're going to saute this. Any questions? All right. Do be careful with your onion selection this time of year going into the winter, because the longer we wait, the more sort of rancid they can get. So I did have a bad discovery with the shallot. The first one I peeled, you just always want to sniff it if it's a little bit dark. It can be a very disappointing experience to add a rancid shallot to a batch of onions. Here's that thing. Okay, so once that's browning, we can add the zucchini. And again, feel free to vary this depending on what's available. You want to mince the courgette rather small. This is kind of on the large side. I was rushing, but yeah, if you want to keep it a little bit smaller, then that's probably good. But it's all going to cook down. And then I've prepared the greens. So this is sort of all that was left in the garden. I did supplement with some really nice fresh curly kale that City Market has right now. But I like having a little lacemato kale. I have a bunch of chard that is about to get killed by the next frost. So now is the time to make a chard filling for your cup. And I just blended, sort of mixed them all together. We're going to add the greens at the very end, so it doesn't really matter that the chard is in with the kale. Chard usually is a much quicker cook than the kale, but it should be fine. And at this stage is when you can add the dried herbs. It's nice to add when there's a little bit of moisture from the onion and the zucchini is starting to give off a little bit of water. And this is just what will transport you back to France with the smell of the rosemary and the thyme. And we can also season it at this time. Feel free to put as much salt and pepper as you like. And I'm just realizing, do you mind getting the cheeses?
Which one for you?
Let's do either Comté or Gruyere. Yeah, thank you. So a word about cheeses. There are all number of cheeses that we are, able to enjoy in the savory galette. And you definitely feel free to experiment. I've had amazing galette with like ratatouille and goat cheese, or sheep cheese, or roquefort is often added to a bechamel sauce. But the classic, if we want to, in this class I'm trying to stick with some of the classics first, is really one of the Alpine cheeses, either Gruyère or Comté. Emmental is also used, but it's interesting to note that what we know as Gruyère actually originates from Switzerland. You probably know that. It's a Swiss cheese from the Fribourg, Jura area. Emmental also is a Swiss cheese, and that's the cheese that we, I think, identify as like that Swiss holy cheese. It's got the bigger hole. There is also a French form of Gruyère, and that is Gruyère de Comté. And that actually is the same recipe, same preparation, same aging as the Gruyère from across the border in Switzerland, but it's done in the French region of the Jura. So that actually, if you're going to the cheese shop and are looking for Gruyère and you don't see it, you can just get Comté. It's often just referred to as Comté here, but it's actually really very similar as Gruyère. The difference is, of course, the terroir, the pasture and the cows that are providing the milk. People say that they have produced a very different milk in those two regions, and actually to be certified with the AOC label as the sort of authentic Gruyère, you have to have a certain breed of cows in that region, and you can't make Gruyère anywhere outside of that region. So there are all these very sort of specific things about the cheeses, but I'd say the take home is that any Gruyère or Comté would be good to use. Feel free to, ask your cheesemonger to do a tasting before you get the cheeses, and you could really see if you like one better than the other. Some people prefer Emmental, and in a lot of the crêperies in France, I would say sort of the lower end crêperie, you will have Emmental, and it's a cheaper cheese, but some people do prefer it. Great, thank you very much. All right, so here we've got a Swiss Gruyère, which is raw by nature of it being Gruyère, and it's aged generally between I would say the lowest is usually 5 months up to a year, and it gets just more kind of a nutty, sort of intense flavor as it's aged. I like to get it as old as you can get here.
We do have a question saying, butter, when do you use salted and when do you use unsalted?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so generally we try to use unsalted, so sweet butter, in baking. And that is because we want to control the salt that we add. We would rather not have it in the butter already and have to adjust our portion of salt. It's better if we use the sweet butter, and then we can season a little bit more specifically to our taste. But there have been many a time when I don't have sweet butter at home and I make do with salty butter, and I just cut down the salt a little bit. Great, thank you. All right, let's see. Carrie, how would you feel about grating some of this? I like to use a microplane to grate the cheese because you will find that it will melt much faster. And it's good to kind of let it be out and coming to room temperature before we grate it and use it. But you can see here, my filling is pretty much done. You want the greens to wilt, but I would say retain some of the vibrancy of their color. So we've added salt. I would add a little bit of maybe fresh ground pepper as well, or white pepper. In French cuisine, white pepper is sort of king. It's used much more than the black pepper. So, you could go that direction. I will then set this aside, and we will put on the crêpe or the galette. All right, so our pan is already buttered. We'll see how this batter performs. Again, it may take 1 or 2 tries. Oh, great. Thank you, Carrie. So we've got, say, just bringing this up to temperature. So if you're talking about right or left-handed, I generally recommend to pour your batter with your dominant hand. That is sort of the more challenging part, and you want a little more precision, and use your other hand to twirl the pan. So we're gonna add this, and see how it goes. All right, my pan wasn't quite warm enough. Do you see how it's not adhering to those spots right away? That tells me that I rushed the pan a bit. It's not quite fully up to temp, but that's all right. The batter is looking, I think, all right. It was good that we thinned it out. See how it's gotten a little bit thinner up here? That's going to make for those kind of crispy, curly edges.
Someone's curious to know if you'd ever shred the courgette or zucchini rather than chop it.
Oh, you could absolutely do that. Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great idea. Again, it would have a slightly different texture. I like having those sort of little bite-sized pieces, but you could absolutely shred it. If I did that, I might go another step and actually salt it and just get some of that water out and let it drain a bit first. But yeah, that's a great idea. And there are all kinds of fillings. Something I'm still sort of finalizing what I'm going to teach in next month's class in terms of fillings, but one thing I love for people to know about is just, you know, sauteing some mushrooms. If you can find some exciting wild mushrooms, that would be great, with a little thyme, and then to make a bechamel sauce and add a little bit of Gruyere to the bechamel. That turns it into sort of it's called a mornay, and then you add the mushrooms to that, and then just once your crepe is ready, sort of spread that on, and it's just so decadent and delicious. There's something about the bechamel with the mushroom that is just really good. It's hard to decide which ones to teach because there are so many good fillings. All right, so as this is going, you can tell because you see the sides are slightly starting to curl, and I'm also smelling. You use your nose a lot in French cooking, especially when you're dealing with these sort of very subtle degrees of frying or cooking. So this is kind of what we're aiming for. This was a little bit underdone on this side, but I'm trying to move us along here. And with the buckwheat, it's going to be a little bit darker. You can notice, again, that already the texture is different. So there are many ways to plate the savory cup or galette, and these you probably have seen in crêperies because they have the larger skillet. They can do more folds. With the smaller ones, we're going to kind of improvise a little bit. So what I would recommend, and you can do this at home. I don't have a second skillet to show you right here, but what I generally recommend is to have a warming pan next to your cup pan. The most, I would say, important rule when you're doing savory cup, when you're making them when they're hot, is that you don't put anything on your cup pan other than butter and batter. Why is that? Because no matter how careful you are with the cheeses, you are going to get some on the sides, and that's going to burn and then sort of clog your pan, and the next prep will be a disaster. So I've learned the hard way. I've been lazy and tried to do it all in one pan, but it's better if you have a second pan that is, you can imagine, is warming right here, and then as soon as the cup is actually done, I would transfer it to this other pan and put on the topping. So this is when I would put on cheese first, and let's imagine that this is hot. You know what, I'm going to cheat and do it in this pan, since I'm only doing one, but don't do this at home. Definitely preserve that one pan, that's really important. But you're going to add the cheese, and there are all kinds of variations. You can crack an egg and fold the sides. There's the galette complète, sort of the full galette from Brittany, which has jambon, the ham, and the egg and the cheese. And I think I'll be showing that next month's class. And then your cheese is melting quickly. I like to put on a good helping of the vegetables. And I try to keep it sort of in the center because we will be folding this crepe, the presentation will be folding it from the sides. All right, so then very carefully, we can slide it onto our plate. And the final step is to fold the sides to how we want to present it. So I had brought, let's see, I had some little pieces of Chinese chives that remained in my garden. So often you can garnish it with something a little exciting, chives or some fresh herbs, just to give it a finished look. If I had used an herb blend that had sage, I would probably put some sage on the side. And voila, you've got your savory galette with buckwheat flour, blé de sarrasin. It's also called black wheat blé noir, and you can see the black specks. So I would love folks to try that. It's really delicious. I wish I could share this with all of you right now with the cheese, but it's a wonderful way to make a really nutritious sort of festive dinner out of crepe. So that concludes the actual instruction part. Are there any questions before I just say a word about some of the traditions around crepe making?
None in the question and answer part so far, but I'll give people a few minutes to put those in there.
Yeah, okay. Do we have the PowerPoint or no? Other side. Okay, no worries. All right, so I may be able to send it out. Carrie will be sending an evaluation tomorrow about this class, and I will see if we can get, I created a little sort of slideshow for you with some pictures and maps from France to see actually how these crêpes are used and served. And there are lots of festivals and celebrations around the crêpe. Somebody asked earlier whether crêpes are considered to be like good luck or auspicious. And that was really great to hear because yes, they absolutely are. There's a wonderful history around crêpes. So there is this festival or sort of holiday, which is called Le Jour des Crêpes, which is the National Crêpe Day. It occurs on the 2nd of February, and it's the mark of 40 days after Christmas. In the Catholic tradition, that's called Candlemas, and it actually dates back all the way to pagan times. It was originally a celebration for the return of the sun, the time of the year when days started to get a little bit longer, where there was sort of the promise of a new harvest and planting. People were starting to think about planting. And there was actually a fertility god in the Breton area, probably of Celtic origin, that people would have this sort of celebration for at this time. Then fast forward to the Middle Ages, there became this tradition of Candlemas, or Le Jour du Chandelier. It's also called the Day of the Return of the Light. And people would make crêpes to use up all of the wheat from their past harvest before they got ready to plant in the coming year. So it was a great way to kind of use up the stocks of wheat. It was also considered sort of something you had to do as a feudal sort of worker to present crêpes to your landowner. So they were a sign also of allegiance. So the peasant folk would make these piles of crêpes and then bring them to their landowner that they were sort of cultivating the land for. But the auspicious piece comes because when everyone was making the crêpes, as sweet as well as savory, they would basically, and this is still carried on today, there was actually a poll that asked how many people in France make crêpes on February 2nd, and I think the poll came back as 85% of the French population is making crêpes that day. So if you two want to join, it's a great tradition. But basically, you make the crêpe and you are supposed to flip it with your non-dominant hand. Okay, and if you can catch it in the pan, And that's a full like flip up into the air and catch it with your non-dominant hand while holding a coin in your other hand. Then you will have good luck for that whole year. And not just you, but this is considered like that will bring prosperity and success to your household and to your family if you can catch that cup. The cup were also considered to be the shape of the sun and represented the return of the sun. Again, this idea of Candlemas, having the light again at the darkest time of the year. So there are a lot of sort of suppositions about the shape of the cup and the goldenness that we're aiming for in terms of browning as representing the sun. So that's I have some great pictures of people actually sort of flipping the cup, and today there are still these crêpes sort of festivals all throughout Brittany at that time in February, where people dress in traditional outfits and everyone goes out onto the streets, and there are just lines of these big griddles and everyone's making the cup, and it's lots of fun. So I definitely encourage you to try. Again, I will be teaching a more participatory class that will be a cook-along in December. So if you don't have the equipment yet, and if you're like me, sort of procrastinate getting supplies you need, feel free to get those, and then you can sign up and we'll actually cook along together. And I will have a camera and be able to sort of watch everyone making cup. So yeah, I think that's it for tonight. Any other questions before we sign off?
No, everyone's just saying thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, and have a great night and good luck with your cup making.